Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone from around the world. Welcome to this GLIO virtual conference and our panel on ESG in infrastructure. Today, we'll be exploring a number of topical themes relevant to how ESG is being integrated into listed infrastructure investments. In particular, topics like net zero carbon and climate risk, new regulations and accountability, data and collaboration. I'm the moderator for today's event, as Fraser said, and my name is Sunny Macero, Chief Strategy Officer at Evora Global. Now, our panelists today join us from Australia, the US and the UK, and it consists of some of the leaders in this field, including David Bentley, who is a partner at Atlas Infrastructure and is a member of the IC there. He has a specific interest in the impact of expected climate change policies on the listed infrastructure sector. David is actively involved with the Institutional Investor Group on climate change, including their infrastructure working group and the Paris Alignment Implementation Working Group. Rebecca Myatt joins us, and she is a portfolio manager for the global listed infrastructure team at First Sentier Investors, responsible for their responsible listed infrastructure fund and for their research coverage of the renewables and water sectors. Rebecca is also involved with Climate Action 100+, where she is a member of the working groups for Southern Company and Next Era Energy. Last but by no means least, Guy McKenzie. He is a director and portfolio manager at BlackRock with a specific focus on infrastructure and utilities in their global real assets securities team. He's actively involved in ESG integration in investment funds, including their BlackRock Infrastructure Sustainable Opportunities and also the BGF Sustainable Global Infrastructure Funds. We've spoken before on this subject, and I know that he, like all of our panelists, will have a lot to contribute. Now, we will be taking questions for the audience, so do post those in the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll either pick them up as we go along or at the end of the session. Now, let's get this conversation started. So starting with you, Rebecca, welcome. And to help us set the scene for our panel today, you know that ESG has really come to the forefront over the last 12 to 18 months. Has this been the case in listed infrastructure as well? And if so, what are the big ESG themes which are affecting your companies?
Yeah, I think it does feel that ESG has been front and center of people's minds over the last 18 months. But really, for listed infrastructure managers, it's always been a key focus. If you think about infrastructure assets, by their very nature, they have large carbon footprints and social licenses to operate. So understanding these aspects of different assets has and always will be, a real center of importance in this space. I think over the last nearly 2 years, with COVID, governments around the world have really had to decide how they want to recover from COVID. And what we've seen, far and wide, is that the answer has been to recover in a more sustainable, cleaner, and climate-friendlier way. So net zero, the pathway to getting there, has really taken centre stage. But equally, we have noticed, an increase in awareness around things like modern slavery, diversity and inclusion, biodiversity loss, and disclosure and regulation.
Okay, and Rebecca, just following up on net zero, as obviously a very popular topic at the moment. Listed infrastructure works obviously in a different way to more direct investment in assets, but what role does listed infrastructure have to play in the net zero carbon challenge?
Well, I've said it before and I'll say it again, but really without infrastructure investment, net zero is just nothing more than a tagline. If you think about the three largest contributors towards carbon emissions, we've got the power generation sector, the transportation sector, and the industrial sector. So, power generation has really been decarbonising over the last decade. And obviously we'll see that trend continue through this decade, with really solar and batteries leading the charge. As we get to the back end of the 2020s, think early 2030s, we'll start to see the electrification of the transportation sector really gain some critical mass. And this, is going to require significant amounts of investment in transmission and distribution grids so that we can pull energy to centrally located places for charging infrastructure to connect. It's also going to require, more investment in renewables because we're electrifying a sector that previously hasn't been electrified. Then when you think about the back end of the 2030s, early 2040s, we anticipate things like hydrogen and renewable natural gas will start to become cost competitive. And that will really allow for decarbonising of sectors such as space heating, shipping, aviation, and other industrial sectors. So when you really think about it, to really address climate change, it really does lie in the hands of infrastructure investment to make it work.
That's great, Rebecca. Thanks for getting us started. Guy, can I bring you in there? In terms of the role of listed infrastructure in net zero, I know this is something you've been looking at actively. Would you have anything to add to what Rebecca has started us with?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with everything that Rebecca just said. I mean, broadly speaking, these companies really are building the assets that form the backbone of a net zero economy. We often describe infrastructure from an operational perspective as the physical assets that underpin the development of an economy and a society. And I think more and more there's an increased focus and prioritization on ensuring that that's really a sustainable development. The importance of renewable energy, as Rebecca noted, is pretty clear. And so is the importance of investing in the grids that connect that renewable energy to customers. The IEA was forecasting that investment in clean energy needed to rise to about $4 trillion a year by the end of this decade in order to support net zero by 2050, which is more than a tripling of what we're seeing right now. And within that, over 800 billion a year in electricity networks, which again is up from less than 300 billion a year right now. So a huge amount of investment, and it's not just the dollar numbers either. You know, there's a need to digitize these grids, given that intermittent renewable energy is not what they were designed for decades ago. In the old days, it was relatively consistent one-way flows, and now we're looking at two-way flows over distribution grids, as households with rooftop solar, for example, can send back excess to the grid. And it isn't just utilities either. You know, toll road operators are working to install more EV charging points along their networks to facilitate the growth in electric vehicles. Even airports are working together with airlines to help facilitate the use of more sustainable fuels and develop the infrastructure needed at airports to ensure that they have access to that supply. I think one other interesting example here in the UK are actually water networks. You know, Boris Johnson's Green Recovery Package. Over the summer, the sector came forward with plans of new investment totaling about £850 million, plus an additional 1.2 billion or so, which was brought forward from future plans. And that included things like the creation of new bathing quality rivers and projects to reduce flood risk, but also technologies that they're developing to help reduce the use of things like chemicals and to use energy more efficiently. I mention that because, you know, it's only 3 of the 9 companies in the UK which are actually listed, but they contributed about 80% of that investment. So certainly carrying their fair share. But more broadly speaking, you know, I think it's a question of financing. You know, across the piece, government coffers are pretty stretched as a result of pandemic-driven stimulus, for example. And I think to deliver on the net zero investment, they're really going to depend on the private sector. And it's a huge amount that's going to be coming from the listed space.
Thank you. I think you both made it clear why infrastructure is so important for the net zero carbon journey. Just staying with you, Guy, for a minute there. Obviously, we've just had COP26 here in Glasgow. I just wonder what your reflections were on some of the outcomes from COP and whether that's had an impact on your companies.
Sure. Well, there were certain clear pledges that perhaps got a lot of attention coming out of COP26. Including, for example, the commitment to end deforestation from 2030 from countries representing 85% of global forests, and a commitment from over 100 countries to reduce their methane emissions by over 30% by 2030, for example, which is certainly encouraging. But I think what was particularly interesting about COP26 was the extent of industry focus and involvement. Historically, there's been a lot more focus on national agreements and country level targets. And here it felt like the private sector was really the sort of core focal point. And that's certainly not inconsistent with what we've been seeing in the lead up either. You know, we're increasingly seeing listed infrastructure companies put forward their own net zero commitments and aligning themselves with science-based target initiative. And I have no doubt that that's going to continue. But it's also how net zero is going to have to be delivered, because we can't just be thinking about individual ambitions from 200 plus individual countries. We really are a global economy, and these are global companies in global industries with global supply chains and global value chains. I think it's interesting, the feedback I received from a CEO of one of our holdings after COP26 was that what really struck him was that pretty much every major FTSE and S&P company was represented there. And there was real solidarity in the desire to move forward aggressively with decarbonization and to think jointly in terms of what needed to be delivered. And for example, one of the biggest impediments that we've been seeing to delivering low carbon energy infrastructure is actually planning processes. It can take years to get all the permits required to get some of these projects off the ground. And that's something that was discussed, it was recognized, it was acknowledged, it's become a focus, and that it's something that even if it wasn't necessarily making headlines, is going to be crucial in delivering the required investments. So, I think in terms of the listed infrastructure space, the implications aren't necessarily game changing, just because I think the companies are already there. They're on that path with coal phase out programs, for example, over the coming decade already announced. And substantial network and renewable energy investment programs to drive decarbonization, which is fully in line with their strategic visions. I think if it means anything incremental for them, it might be an acceleration of that investment, facilitated by perhaps more regulatory and political support, to help reduce those lead times.
That's insightful, Guy. Thank you. So, David, just coming to you in terms of COP26. In terms of those implications for listed infrastructure, can I get your thoughts on what that might mean for the leaders? Do you agree with Guy that the industry, all the companies are there, or are there laggards that are going to be shown up following what's gone on and discussed at COP26?
That's good. So I probably agree with Guy that I think for the most part, the listed infrastructure, industry. I mean, I think most companies in general, most large companies are, they're singing mostly from the same song sheet, particularly outside the energy industry. So if we can leave that to the side just for one moment, there are still the concern that we have, I guess, is that there's a mismatch sometimes between the rhetoric of some companies and just the reality of their business model and where their business is at the moment. And it will be very interesting to see this, whether companies' net zero commitments and various other, sustainability reports and the like can actually be, can be backed up with actually tangible action. And I guess, probably the biggest sector that we sort of have questions over is probably obviously the natural gas sector, and so oil and natural gas, which is not to say that they can't make a strong transition, but there's definitely going to be a requirement for significant breakthroughs in terms of the cost of carbon capture and storage, and other opportunities to sort of reduce emissions in that area, particularly fugitive emissions. And then whether there's opportunities to use that infrastructure for sort of lower carbon fuels. We certainly hope that there is, and we wouldn't call them laggards by any stretch, but there's a lot of investment that's going to be required in certain areas of the infrastructure sector. Probably, there's one of the things that I was going to say was that there's going to be a requirement to make significant investment, regardless of whether you're a leader or a laggard. Really, the main question is, when do you want to make that, and over what time frame, or do you want to stick your head in the sand and say, okay, we'll wait for other people to move first, and then we'll use some of the decreasing cost advantages, and we'll start taking steps in the late 2020s or early 2030s to decarbonize, which is fine in a sense, but it means that you compress a lot of your expenditure and a lot of your capex in a relatively short space of time. We're encouraging all of our companies, portfolio companies, and companies that we don't invest in at the moment to start investing now, basically, and to be much more smooth and sort of consistently deployed in terms of their capital expenditure. It makes the discussion with regulators much easier. It means that any impacts on customer bills can be sort of phased over time, and that they can be a level of accommodation for what is going to be significant expenditure, which will have to be compensated for at some point. So from a laggards and leaders perspective, no industry will be immune, but the question is when do you want to spend the capital, really?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, David, about when you make that decision to invest and over what time frame. I've got a couple of follow-up questions on that. One is actually from the floor, and I'll be interested also if Rebecca and Guy have any comments on this. But one of the questions from Siobhan was about how do you mentioned the mismatch between rhetoric and action, and Siobhan's asking, how do you evaluate the net zero transition plans of your portfolio companies?
Yeah, well, what we do is we're fortunate in the sense that we have quite a small portfolio. So we only run 20 stocks or 21 stocks in the portfolio at the moment. So we can engage pretty closely with the companies that are in the portfolio on a fairly regular basis. So we don't just go, okay, well, these guys made a net zero pledge and bingo, we'll build that into the model. We walk through every single asset that these guys, that each of the companies has in their portfolio. We look at what the reasonable, particularly in the electricity sector, which is probably 50% of our portfolio. What's the timeline for closing down, these power stations? How are you going to replace that generation? So it's very much a discussion with them. And if we can't see tangible, like actual plans, then we don't give them the credit, and we sort of have a tail on their emissions profile rather than just trusting that something will happen at some point. And in a sense, the same goes for companies that are relying on negative emissions to hit their net zero targets. We tend to be very skeptical that those negative emissions can actually be achieved. And so we, as much as companies might say, no, seriously, we'll buy some offsets, we don't build that in. I can see Rebecca smiling there. She may have a similar experience.
Rebecca or Guy, I mean, that's a very active approach from David in terms of the engagement with their companies. Do you take a similar approach in terms of transition plans, or anything else to add?
Yeah, I'd probably just add that I completely agree with David on offsets. We just don't really think of that's the way the world works. You need to be actively changing your business model to hit zero, not just net zero. So the idea of offsets doesn't really work for us. I'd also note that for a lot of the utilities, which is where the bulk of emissions come from within the portfolio, they do submit generation plans over a 5 to 10 year view. So we do have a really good idea in terms of where they think about those capital dollars being deployed. And when you look at the emissions of a utility, what you tend to see is step changes. So, a coal plant will come offline and you'll step down, and then you may be relatively flat for a few years and then step down again. So you can actively have engagements with companies around specific assets so that you can have a really good idea in terms of how that emission trajectory goes down over time. But this idea that people have of annual reduction in emissions, what actually really happens is it becomes like a stepped approach. But there's a lot of engagement that goes with that, with the companies, and understanding in what goes behind that net zero. And I think for a lot of companies, the question is, how do we get from 80 to 100? So I think people can really see how they get to that 80%, but getting from 80% to 100%, a lot of the assumptions behind that is predicated on new technologies coming to market and being cost competitive enough to get them that last 20%. And that's what a lot of companies are grappling with, is if we set a net zero target, are we making assumptions about something that we don't really know yet? And that's something that I think is not always widely understood.
Great. Guy, do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I'll be brief because I think that was pretty comprehensive from both David and Rebecca, but I'd echo comments on direct engagement with the companies. I mean, we meet with each of our portfolio companies 2 times a year, at least, sometimes more. And so we're directly engaging in terms of how exactly these pathways are being met. As Rebecca said, it tends to be step changes because there's specific assets that they have online. So if it's a coal phase out program, for example, and it's a question of, well, it's 2030 rather than 2025, for example, and you try to work through, what the reasons are for that. It's not just a question of, well, we're generating so much profit from this asset and we just really want to keep it alive. and we're not willing to invest in sort of delivering that transition, is that, the transition just really isn't feasible over the very near term. That, maybe this is a coal plant that's in Brazil in the outskirts of Sao Paulo, and it's the only source of power for a really low income community, and we simply can't shut it down until we have a viable alternative. And we're actively looking at viable alternatives, and at the absolute latest, the specific target actually was recently brought forward to 2025. But it's in terms of looking at what the drivers of that are, and oftentimes it's just a question of when there's something. When there is a feasible low carbon alternative which is emerging, and ensuring that can happen, which partly comes back to Rebecca's point as well, in terms of sometimes the targets are technology dependent, but what we've seen over the past decade plus is the cost of onshore wind and solar has come down by over 90%. Even the cost of offshore wind has come down by somewhere around 65% or more, and nobody anticipated these developments at the time, or certainly I didn't. So I think there is a real push towards more innovation, delivering more scale and supply chains, and making some of these technologies a little bit cheaper through developing them in some of the higher income countries, for example, such that they can be deployed more broadly, more globally.
Great points, thank you. David, coming back to you, you talked about the decision about the time frame for investment, and Rebecca's already mentioned that kind of last 20% of a transition pathway may not be clear. So I just wondered whether you felt that the transition pathways and also physical climate risks were clear enough for fund managers to make those informed decisions, and whether there was more clarity for some sectors than others.
I definitely think definitely the 80-20 rule again. I think that we can make a very good we can make a pretty good fist of what's likely to happen, I think, in the next 10 to 15 years. Well, I guess hopefully we're going to be like the IEA, and we're going to underestimate or overestimate the cost and underestimate the deployment. So hopefully that's the case. But I think we have a pretty good, whether it's there's so many of these various bodies that are producing transition pathways. So you've got guys like Vivid Economics. You've got the IGCC's done a whole lot of work. The IEA has pathways. The SBTI has pathways that you can benchmark yourself against, and some of those are even down to specific sectors. So one of the things we do is not just benchmark our whole portfolio, but we benchmark every single asset and every single sort of sub asset within that asset. And it's amazing how much information is available for you to be able to, well, for companies to be able to do that if they can take the time to do it. So from a transition pathway standpoint, I think as Rebecca says, the first 80%, the next probably out to 2035 or even 2040, I think we can have, it might happen a little bit quicker. I guess that's the thing. The question is probably the time frame over which a lot of this happens. Whether you're going to be 5 years here or 5 years there, that's probably more of the question. The actual stages that we need to go through are actually quite well understood, I think. So you can't have 80% renewable energy until you have some kind of good storage and balancing capability in your network. There's just some things that are going to be better to be electrified, and some things that are better to use alternative fuels, whether it's hydrogen or biomass or whatever it is. So there's the stages are pretty well understood. The time frame is we can have a good guess at, but sometimes it'll be a bit quicker and sometimes a bit slower. And then there's a question of cost as well. Having said that, I think if as a manager we spend enough time and we really think about this and we consult enough people, I think we can actually get a pretty good understanding of what our portfolio looks like and what's going to happen with the assets. You mentioned climate risk. That's probably the other end of the certainty scale, and it's such a. We know that some areas are going to be wetter and some areas are going to be drier and some areas are going to be windier and some areas are going to be quieter. And there's a number of companies doing work around that, but the complexity of the interaction of climate and physical climate impacts is quite. And even then, even if you can work out what the physical climate impact is, working out what impact it has on your particular asset, that's that's another stage of complexity and uncertainty. And to be honest, except in extreme circumstances where we do think, we own Edison International in California, so we have to consider, the potential for increasing wildfires. There's some things that are a little bit easier to predict and are more certain, but there's a lot of stuff that we're finding it very difficult to forecast, and there's not that much consistency of data out there, to be honest.
I think that's a good point, David, on the physical climate risk. I mean, we've been tracking this market over the last 18 months, and there seems to be a new provider almost every month. And I would say that the market, just for the physical risk assessment, is still nascent, let alone the one for calculating the value at risk and the assets. And even in that area, the focus is very much on physical damage and doesn't look at other impacts on value, such as disruption to operation, as an example. But great. So in terms of, Rebecca, I'm going to come back to you. In terms of the pathways being clear, at least for the next 10 to 20 years, that first 80%, but there is still this gap between rhetoric and action. I just wondered what your thoughts were on the idea that's quite popular at the moment about linking ESG performance to executive remuneration to drive that focus of attention and perhaps close that gap. Do you think that could move companies forward faster than we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about the 80% to the 100%, we're talking out in the 2040s, right? So most long-term incentive plans are rolling 3 years, and obviously you've got short-term incentive plans that are annual. So, what we're seeing is that ESG is definitely forming a bigger component of executive remuneration. We've seen some European companies allocating in the 10 to 20% of long-term incentive plans to the achievement of a broad range of different ESG goals. What we've also seen is companies that had previously had these ESG goals as part of their annual cash bonuses, moving them into the longer term incentive plans. And that acknowledges that, this is a journey, this is a long-term journey, and, therefore we need to have these longer term plans aligned with that. So if you think you've got a net zero pathway, you should be able to understand, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, what the short and medium term goals are, and then link executive remuneration to that. I'd note, by moving it from the short-term goal to the longer-term incentive plan, there's more dollars on, at risk for executives as well. So, we do like to see that in LTIP plans because we think it fully aligns the companies with what they say is their strategy. So, if you have a utility talking about net zero, talking about their decarbonisation pathway in these stepped approaches that we've mentioned, then we think that there should be executive remuneration at risk for achieving those goals as well.
Great. And just to follow up on that, obviously, as an individual, you'd like to be, I'd like to be comfortable, like the comp plan is within my control. Do you think that executives will receive that kind of incentive well? Do you think that they have enough information to be able to measure that in the right way? Or is it going to create discomfort?
No, I think so. It's all about having remuneration that is within your control, and these executives do have control of what this pathway looks like to some degree. Now, obviously, they need regulatory approval for CapEx, so we acknowledge that. But when they file with the regulator in terms of how they see their generation portfolio over the next 5 to 10 years, they've got a really good view in terms of what's happening. To David's point, that could actually move forward a little bit, but I don't anticipate it's moving further out. So I think there's enough information there for it to be in long-term incentive plans, and we're seeing more and more companies do it, acknowledging that investors want this accountability. Us as fund managers, we have our remuneration tied to the performance of the fund, the same experience that the client has. So why do we not have that with the companies that we invest in? Their top 5 strategic priorities, my guess is one of them's net zero, or one of them's decarbonisation, especially for a utility. So why wouldn't there be some accountability there?
Brilliant, thank you very much. Now, Guy, just looking ahead over the next 12 months or so, in terms of key themes when it comes to ESG and infrastructure, do you see that being focused on climate change, or do you see it broader than that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess in listed infrastructure from an ESG perspective, I really think what we'll see is sort of an acceleration and a broadening of current trends rather than sort of something starkly new. We say ESG, but as you suggest, there's a fair lot of focus on the E component of that right now, probably more than ever. And I think, you know, over the next 12 months, I guess the first thing that we're likely to see is an increasingly global acceleration in the development of renewable energy. And this has been a trend for the past decade plus. It really began with a greater focus in high income countries, as I mentioned. They were able to subsidize projects to get them off the ground when they weren't necessarily economically viable on a standalone basis. But now in more and more places, they are. I touched on offshore wind earlier. 2022 is set to be a record year for auctions in offshore wind, and the bulk of the developers who are bidding on those projects are in the listed space. And that's something that was historically seen as you know, too high risk and too high cost to actually, you know, ever develop on an economically viable basis, excluding subsidies. When I say historically, I mean less than a decade ago. And yet the costs have just come down so substantially that something that started in Northern Europe in a few countries has now gone global, and you have projects which are taking off in the US, in Taiwan, and, you know, auctions coming up in Japan and South Korea, for example, Poland too. So it really is going global. And so I think, you know, all that means from a listed infrastructure perspective is, you know, the capacity build out targets being firmed up, or increased confidence in delivering what they're delivering, for those companies that already have ambitious targets, and maybe more and more companies coming into that development sector. Some of the biggest developers of renewable energy right now are historically, you know, either thermal generation based or even oil and gas companies. Secondly, I'd probably look to increasingly prominent environmental commitments on some of the greenfield and brownfield infrastructure development outside of the utility space. You know, we're seeing an increasing number of airports, for example, putting forward net zero commitments and focusing some investment on moving towards achieving that. You know, things like rooftop solar for self-generation, or investment in their own electric vehicle charging stations, and again, investment in the infrastructure that will be required to accommodate things like sustainable aerofuel, which is still in the very, very early days, but at least is starting to get off the ground. And it's not just in the developed world either. You know, India's first net zero airport is now under construction near Delhi, and that's something that's being developed by a listed infrastructure company too. And finally, and I think linked to that, you know, company-specific ESG strategies will broaden further. You know, I'm not sure. I remember the last management meeting that I was in where ESG wasn't a discussion topic, and companies clearly recognize the importance more than ever. They're appointing independent sustainability directors. They're publishing increasingly detailed pathways and strategies in their sustainability reports, and it's an increasingly a consideration in their own decisions for their own capital deployment, their own investments. So I think that needs to go further, and I think that it will go further. So it's, I think, very broad focus across the space.
That's great, Guy. Well, I think all of that so far has painted a really good picture of where the sector's at. We're going to move into the second part of the conversation, which is going to focus a bit more on accountability and also the importance of regulations. Now, Rebecca, we've already touched very briefly on executive remuneration, but I just wondered whether we could broaden that out for your views on the best approaches for driving action, because there's often a kind of polarized discussion around whether that's kind of exclusions and divestment, or something that's more active in terms of a stewardship approach to investing. And obviously the group here is very actively involved with their investments. I just wondered what your reflections were on those different approaches.
Yeah, look, we think the best way to drive action is through engagement. You know, if you divest of a company's shares, they just get bought by someone else who doesn't really care about these goals. Whereas if you choose to engage, you know, you can create change through kind of applying pressure to companies to change the way that they do business or to think in different ways. You know, we try and engage across multiple different ways, so individually, collaboratively, You know, in some cases we'll write letters to the board or to executive management teams. And obviously we do have our proxy voting rights as well to spur action and change. You know, if I think back 6 years ago, I think there was a lot more discussion around, is divestment the best approach, especially in some parts of Europe. And I think the thoughts are changing much more towards our view of the world, which is actually, you know, that doesn't really do anything. It doesn't create any change. But, you know, through engaging with companies, through saying, you know, why can't this coal plant be pushed forward? What are some of the impediments to doing this? You know, you can really create change and action. And that's what we want here, right? So with environmental goals that we've talked about today, we want it to happen quicker, but we also want it to happen in a socially responsible way, so that, you know, people are not put in vulnerable positions because their bills go up so aggressively. So, you know, I think engagement is absolutely the right way, and you know, that's how we feel that we're being good stewards of our clients' capital.
Yeah, if I can sort of jump on that. The thing with a lot of this idea of divestment is that if you sell it, it just disappears, or it sort of in some way undermines the business model. I mean, infrastructure assets just don't go away. You know, you sell these assets, you know, it doesn't, the coal plant's built. It's not going to prevent this coal plant from, in fact, it makes it harder. If you increase the cost of capital for an organization that needs to change, then it actually makes it more difficult for that organisation to implement the changes that are required. We much prefer to recognise that these, you know, there's one thing you don't want to be sort of funding more, you know, more polluting assets, but recognising that a lot of these assets have been in the ground for 10, 20, 30 years. The main question is actually, how do we, as Rebecca said, how do we transition away from those assets in a well-considered, careful, and socially responsible manner, so that you have, you know, what a sort of a fair transition, I think, is the current buzzword, which I think is a very important thing to do. But yeah, divestment is for us as not a particularly effective strategy, particularly in infrastructure. It might work in other areas, but not for us.
Okay, that's great. Guy, just very quickly on that. I mean, we've talked previously about kind of setting caps on capital allocation to certain sectors. I just wondered whether you felt that was an effective approach as well for driving change, where there's a potentially in the future there's a target cap.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I think there's a range of issues here. I mean, if you're looking at a single company, which is in simplistic terms a single asset, which is a coal generation asset, you know, just trying to drive them to change, to sort of decommission their asset and build a new renewable energy asset to replace it with, or if that's the entirety of their fleet, it becomes a little bit difficult. But that said, you know, the last thing that you want to do is starve companies of capital who are really driving the transition. And it's not the companies that are building new coal-fired generation assets now, it's the companies that have the legacy assets in their portfolios from when they were needed, when this was really the only alternative, and before net zero became such a core focus. So just saying, well, you know, look, 5% of your portfolio or 10% of your portfolio is still in coal generation assets, recognizing it's not necessarily any of your forward-looking investment. You're building a tremendous amount of renewable energy capacity, and that's absolutely something that we want to ensure that we're supporting, because they're driving those decarbonization efforts. Then really it's just a question of, well, as Rebecca said, stewardship and ensuring that, you know, they're being socially responsible. They're not investing necessarily in new thermal generation assets. They have a plan for how they're going to replace those assets with cleaner alternatives, and for bringing their carbon emissions down. It's not something that you just want to sort of screen out altogether and say, we won't provide you with capital, because like I said, they are the ones who are driving the bulk of that transition.
Super. And Rebecca, you outlined some very intelligent approaches there for driving action. I just wonder whether, looking to your clients, whether you were seeing your investment mandates change to incorporate ESG, and whether there was different approaches between legacy and new assets.
I think because ESG is such an integral part of, you know, owning and operating infrastructure, it's really rare to see I've ever seen clients not asking about how ESG is integrated into the investment process. Even a decade ago, this was, still questions that we got asked. I think what has changed has been the level of details that clients are requiring, the reporting requirements and justification for certain holdings. They want a deeper understanding around the transition. Like as Guy was talking, if you do have some legacy coal assets, they want a deeper understanding about how these coal assets are being decommissioned over time and what forms of energy are being replaced. They want more information if a company has had historical controversies. What have you done about that? How have you engaged with them? What has the company done to change? I think we're seeing more and more of our clients commit to net zero. So they're wanting products that are aligned with that journey as well. And I think we're seeing clients that want more than integration as well. It's something that we identified around 6 years ago. And that was really the rationale behind launching the Responsible Listed Infrastructure Fund in 2017. So I think the bar is just getting higher and higher, and I think that's a good thing all around.
Super. And just to wrap up this section, David, in terms of the EU and regulation, there's obviously multiple initiatives at the moment. And do you find that these are helping or hindering in terms of this progress on climate change?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, I would say, in general. Obviously, regulatory certainty is good, and clear guidelines are good. To the extent that some of these things can result in just hoop jumping, we just need to be. I think enough thought is going into them to make them sort of meaningful and tangible. But there's sometimes making things too black and white, can lead to unforeseen outcomes that may not be helpful. Having said that, look, any attempt, I think, to, particularly with things like the EU taxonomy, to really be much clearer about, what is sustainable and what's an adverse event and things like this, to the extent that can sort of clean up some of the potential for greenwashing, I think that's certainly quite helpful. And maybe it gives investors a bit of a better view of what's in their portfolio. And if it means that, well, from our clients' perspective, if our clients can actually compare much more clearly our portfolio with those of the other portfolios that they hold in their the other asset managers that they hold in their portfolio, that's a good thing, certainly for us, because we think that we spend an awful lot of time doing that, and sometimes we skeptically look across the investment marketplace at the use of certain terms in a more sort of flippant way, you might say. Things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms are also kind of probably quite good if implemented well, because it does provide a little bit more certainty and some comfort that there's going to be some protections, I guess, for companies that do the right thing domestically in Europe. So in general, I think there's a growing regulatory certainty, but we do need to avoid the unnecessary hoop jumping.
Okay. Well, I think there's a lot of positive there in terms of both voluntary and voluntary action and how regulation is guiding us in the right direction. But we're just going to take a pause from the panel discussion now to hear from Rachid Kansal. He's joining us from the Rocky Mountain Institute, where he's going to give us what Fraser has called a short data blast, showing off the analysis that they've done on US utilities and their path to decarbonisation. But when we come back to the panel, we'll continue the discussion, including a look at how ESG data is being integrated into investment decision making. So over to you, Rachid.
Thanks so much, Sunny, and thank you to Fraser and Glio for this opportunity. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody, from wherever you're calling from. So I'm going to give a really short, almost walkthrough of an open source data platform that we launched this year that I think speaks to some of the broader trends that I've been hearing during the panel discussion. But before I get into that, I just want to step back for a second and talk about why we care about data, which I know sounds like a silly question, but just maybe stepping back for a second, data forms the foundation for so many of the, not just analyses and models that we run, but also a lot of the assumptions that we make about investment decisions and about, the upside sort of opportunities and downside risks. And the question then becomes, what kind of data really helps to inform decisions that maximize long-term, returns from investments and minimize current or emerging downside risks. And my pitch to this group is that data that speaks to not just the outcomes of the utility sector, for example, but also the drivers for utility action, actually maximizes that opportunity for investment returns and minimizes that risk. And so what do I mean by that exactly? And for that, I'm going to share my screen in a second. I'll be walking through this website here, and feel free to follow along on the slide if you'd like. I won't mind. So what I mean by a focus on outcomes and drivers, not just on outcomes, I'm going to use a really, I guess, overused metaphor in the climate space, which is that of an iceberg, but hopefully it's helpful. So this, if you look at what you're seeing on the screen here, is what I would call the outcomes of utility actions from a climate perspective. These are all really important, emissions reductions, fossil plants retiring, clean plants coming online, and so on. And I think a lot of metrics and a lot of data in the sector today really focuses increasingly on these metrics, which is obviously critical. But what I am, the sort of pitch I'm going to make this group is that is a necessary but insufficient view on the data that is necessary for sort of maximizing returns in the long term. And what I'm going to suggest is that in addition to tracking outcomes, that folks should also focus on what is driving those outcomes. And that's really where we get into what's below the waterline in this metaphorical iceberg. And those are things like, how are utilities currently investing in what the historical investments look like? What is sitting on their, sort of their balance sheets? But also things like, what are the current trends on customer impacts and community impacts, worker impacts look like? What is the policy, political, and regulatory framework these utilities operate in, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level? And then finally, how are utilities operating their plants or planning to operate their plants? And I guess just weaving it all together, my suggestion here is that data that incorporates all of this, that incorporates both what's below the waterline and what's above the waterline, which is what is driving action and what the outcomes of that action are, gives investors, especially infrastructure investors, an opportunity to really maximize their returns in the long run, especially given the long-term investment horizons and sort of illiquidity of the sector in general. Now, to illustrate this point, I'm going to give a really quick example of this and toggle over to our sort of interactive portal here. This really focuses on the US utility space, so I'm just using this as an example. I'm sure there's some relevance to other utility sectors, so just bear that in mind. What we're looking at here is the US utility sector's emissions over the last 15 years or so. And what you can see clearly, which is probably not surprising to this group, is that utility emissions in the US sector have gone down significantly, as you can see, from 2010 to 2020, largely driven by a shuttering of coal plants and a lower utilization of existing coal plants, which has to some extent been offset by an increase in gas-related emissions, which is this light gray line over here, and this black line is coal. So what this shows us at the surface level, what's above the waterline, is that this is great, right? And it is great, but it is not the whole picture. And what I would suggest is that if you go below the waterline to see what is driving this action and really toggle to the investments view on this, what you can see over here is this metric over here is showing the assets on utility books broken down by technology. And what you actually see is that despite emissions declining, fairly significantly in the last 10 years in the US utility sector, fossil assets on utility books actually have been increasing significantly. Even coal, which is supposed to have been declining, and there have been coal retirements, and actually in 2019 reached its peak. Fossil assets on utility books were the highest they've ever been. So this is just one example of the importance from our perspective of looking at data more holistically and looking at both what's driving action, but also in addition to what the outcomes of that action are. And I'll just wrap up with this one final visual and really zoom out to the opportunity that's in front of us today. So I heard one of the panelists talk about electrification as an opportunity, and it does represent a really significant opportunity here. What you're seeing in this chart over here is for the US economy, at least, the rate of decarbonization that's needed from a climate alignment perspective versus the dotted line, which shows where things are headed without any new policies. Now, electrification, if we were to go through with it, this is what it could look like, which is this massive increase in electricity demand that is coming from three sectors: industry, transport, and buildings, which results in this huge deployment of renewables and other carbon-free technologies. We estimate, like, conservatively, this is a $1.3 trillion opportunity in the US alone by 2030. More than that, 3 to 5 trillion by 2050, just at a really conservative estimate. And so the opportunity is obviously there. It's significant. It offers the opportunity to grow returns and decarbonize at the same time. But just circling back to the importance of comprehensive data, one result of, I think, a narrower focus on metrics could be that, if, for example, fossil assets on utility books stay on the books, even as clean energy is built, electricity prices become more expensive, and electrification as an avenue becomes less attractive for regulators, politicians, customers, leading to a lost investment opportunity for a lot of infrastructure investors. So I'll just close out here by just summarizing that the opportunity is significant, the urgency is there, the technology is ready. But what I would just pitch again to the group for consideration is that the data needs to consider the drivers for action and not just the outcomes. And that, I think, will lead to the best possible investment outcome for a lot of investors.
Thank you, Rachid. That's great. Just as we get the cameras back on, I think there might be some questions from the panel, and I'm also interested in their perspective on how useful that data is, particularly looking at the difference between outcomes and drivers, as you mentioned. In terms of the conversation you've been having with investors or investment managers, how are they looking at integrating this into their investment lifecycle? Are they looking at using it at the research stage? Are they looking at it in terms of identifying deals, or later on, perhaps in operation? Well, sorry, in looking at how they allocate capital in the future.
Assuming that question was for me, I'm not sure.
Yeah, first of all, to get started, just while we get everybody back.
Sure. So in our conversations, it's mostly been with a lot of investment banks. I think the first step has really been on tracking and measuring progress across portfolios, and doing so in a way that is standardized, or maybe not standardized, but fairly uniform and consistent across sectors and across geographies. The response we've gotten to data like this has been really positive. I think the challenge that remains is the data quality and availability varies so wildly across sectors and geographies, and how do we overcome and make that the same level of granularity available across those different sectors and geographies. So there's been a really positive response in terms of incorporating data like this that's publicly available into sort of measuring the progress of the investment portfolios. But the sort of barrier we're still coming up against is data availability, which is something we're looking to address with some partners.
Thank you. Do we have everybody back? I can't. Yes, we do. Does anybody want to come in on how they're using data in their investment decision making, or particularly on Ratchet's data set and how useful that would be?
I could probably kick off with it and say a couple of things on that. So one of the challenges always, particularly in listed infrastructure, when you're trying to work out, and what we're trying to do ultimately is do we buy this asset or that asset? It's a little bit different than, my old days in the unlisted investment world where you were just looking at one asset and you sort of considered that in very much a standalone basis. So one of the challenges is definitely making sure that data sets that you have are comparable and consistent and reflect a single world view. And it doesn't matter, but it has to be a particular, current a current state of the world based on the standardization of measurement, and also a future pathway which is based on a fairly standardized set of information. It is very difficult to find anything that actually provides that sort of global consistency. RMI is certainly, well done Rashid and his team. They're certainly one of the best people that we've come across certainly from a depth perspective, but also the way that information is presented is I think is going to be of great use to firms like us. Ultimately, I guess there's no substitute for doing your own work, though, for us, and just talking to companies, and we don't necessarily need to cover every single asset and sector in the whole world. We just need to make sure that the assets that we do buy have we understand what their emissions are and what their expected sort of profile of those are.
Thanks, David. And just to follow up on that, in terms of the ESG data universe, do you think that the right data is being sought? Or do you see any material gaps, particularly in terms of forward-looking data, as we talked about climate risk earlier?
The biggest thing that we see, it's not really a data gap necessarily, but it's really a classification gap, which is that we don't think that there's enough emphasis being placed on the broader sort of emissions profile of industries. So it's, we can spend an awful lot of time looking at scope 1 and scope 2 emissions for an airport, but really it's an airport, and basically whatever the ground handling guys are doing in terms of burning diesel in their little trucks is irrelevant compared to the cost of flying from LA to London or whatever it happens to be. So there are industries, and probably roads is one, airports is another, and pipelines is another, where that it's not even really scoped through what we consider as network emissions. So what are the emissions that are the result of an inevitable result of your business model? And there's just so much inconsistency in the way that this is considered. And the challenge that I think we have is, when we're all running around focusing on scope 1 and 2 emissions, we can sometimes kid ourselves about the sustainability of certain business models, and maybe we can even fail to push management. What gets measured gets gets done, and sometimes we just need to be careful that we don't lose the wood for the trees, and we need to keep focusing on, is this business in which we're investing, is it sustainable? Does it have a prospect in the future of being sort of low or zero carbon? And that's a really, really important question for us, particularly with our investments in airports and roads. We don't have much in the pipeline sector, but if you're a pipelines investor, the question is this business model something that's going to be a viable business in 30, 40 years?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Rachid, I'm going to bring you back in, I think, as you wanted to make a point there.
Yes, thank you. I'll just add on to that one of the sort of analyses that we've heard requested a lot when we presented this Utility Transition Hub platform is forward-looking projections on utility resource plans versus 1.5C alignment. And so that is something we're working on actively. And the utility sector, at least in the US, is in some ways well positioned, because a lot of that data is publicly available, and with some assumptions around how future assets will operate, you can create a range based on what the utility submitted to its regulator. Where are its emissions ending up versus where it needs to be? And so that is something we're actively working on in the next couple of months to have that come out. But I don't know how that works for a lot of other sectors. So the utility sector may be an outlier there, but I just wanted to flag that is something we've got a lot of requests on.
Thank you. And Rebecca, just picking up on some of the things that David was saying, we've seen some criticism this week, I guess, of ESG data and what it's showing us, and whether it's showing all of the relevant risks. And we're also seeing a lot of regulations which are trying to tackle particularly issues of greenwashing. So I just wondered whether you felt that those regulations were driving better data availability and quality that's relevant to your decision making.
Yes and no. I mean, I think companies today are providing better data because their investors are requiring them to do so, and they're getting questions from the likes of us three asking them about their emissions profile, and there's much more focus on it. So I think it's more coming from that they lock themselves out of investors if they don't disclose the relevant information. I think what regulation does is kind of bring a bigger focus on data availability and quality, and it kind of highlights those companies that are behind the eight ball. And it also brings with it some level of standardization. You know, as we've discussed here, there is no global standard. So, you know, US utilities is a really nice subsector because everyone reports in a similar fashion. But then, you know, when you go to Europe or to the UK, those utilities report in a different fashion. So, you know, it's our job to try and find something comparable globally. But I think that, you know, obviously we start with EU taxonomy or SFDR. The UK will do something similar, and maybe we'll see something in the US. I mean, having some level of global standardization obviously is great. But, you know, as David quite rightly said, there's nothing as a substitute for just hard work and understanding and engaging and comparing, you know, a US utility with a UK utility with a European utility, and understanding how they each compare on different metrics.
Great. And just one final question, I think, on this for Guy. Just in terms of the use of ESG data, do you see that making it easier for you to balance ESG priorities against delivering the strong investment returns that I'm sure your clients are looking for?
Yeah, I mean, actually, on this point, I think it's important to not consider the two issues as completely independent or separate considerations in terms of your returns and sustainability. I think there's really two elements to it. Obviously, we're looking at risk-adjusted returns, not just delivering really attractive total returns for investors, and ESG is certainly a pretty clear risk factor from our perspective. We're talking a lot about climate risk, so risk for the E factor, but I think it's clear that absolutely will affect longer-term cash flows of the companies. There's also risks around the broader societal considerations, or, you know, employee well-being for the S factor within ESG and corporate governance. I think it's long been a consideration as an investment risk. So for our team, ESG has always been a component of our cost of equity buildup, and hence it's factored into our valuations. And hence, to your point, you know, the better the data that we can get, the more forward-looking, the more comprehensive, the more consistent, then, you know, the more consistent we can deliver on our valuations. That being said, you know, there's always an element of analytical overlay, because there's really no substitute for that. I think, you know, the second element of it is, well, I'll keep it there. I guess what I'm saying is I think that the risks from an ESG perspective are real risks, which affect the valuation of our businesses. And I think there's, you know, a broad realm of opportunities within the sustainable listed infrastructure space. The better the data, the better the output, and the better the investment decisions.
They're great points to finish on, I think, Guy. I knew, given the caliber of the panelists today, that we would struggle not to stop talking, but I'm being chased for time by Fraser. So I just want to say, in wrapping up today's event, I think you'll agree that we've comprehensively explored the topic of ESG and infrastructure. I mean, we've heard about how climate change is a dominant theme at the moment. We've also heard how investment managers like those represented here today are actively incorporating ESG into their investment decision making. Some of that is voluntary, but there is alongside the regulated action. So I think that's very promising, and there is obviously momentum building. Data is playing a key role in informing these decisions, but using that data isn't without its challenges, and being clear about what risks are being made transparent or being obscured in that data, I think, is importantly. Finally, I think the point I wanted to leave it on was that there is room for collaboration to progress this ESG agenda, and I think Glio will continue to play an active role on that. So I think Fraser will say a bit more about that. But finally, just to close, I'd like to thank our panelists, Rebecca, Guy, David, and Rachit. Also, Fraser and Lee have been working very hard behind the scenes to make this all run smoothly as an event. And finally, from me, thank you all for taking part and listening today to what we had to say. Back to you, Fraser.